initially I was thinking, oh, well, I'll just drive on over from Fort McMurray to Grand Prairie. And then you look at the map and say, why is that a 7-hour drive? And so I know that they've made a partial road there, but it is a bit mystifying to me why it is that the portion of our province that generates the most revenue for the provincial treasury does not have the resources that you need to be able to thrive and prosper as a connected community. Just know I see that. So the lack of roads was one thing, but then when we went down to Wabasca, there was a 2-hour stretch in the middle of the night on a 2-lane road with lots of trucks going where there was no cell phone coverage. So ladies, I don't know how you feel secure driving on the roads that late at night when you know that if an emergency happens, there is no one to be able to come out and no way to contact emergency vehicles, no way to have people come out and help you. So I always feel very unsettled when I'm in northern Alberta about how the infrastructure and the resources are not there for you. And then of course, going to Wabasca, and then Slave Lake, and then on to High Prairie, a couple other things that I learned. So in Wabasca, they have closed the hospital down at night. So it's only open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And there was a young family that was at the senior center that we were at, and they had a brand new baby. And I just said, how are things going for you? And they moved up there because he's got a job in technology at one of the energy companies. He says, it's a great job. They also provide me housing. I said, but what about health services? He said, their little one had a really high fever. And I said, what'd you do? She said, well, thank heavens it was during the day. Can you imagine, because they were able to go to the hospital during the day, if that little baby had that high fever after 7 o'clock at night, they would have had to bundle her up, get in the car and drive an hour and a half to get to Slave Lake. And it doesn't stop there. So I went to High Prairie, and I'm told that they have a brand new hospital. It's been in operation for 4 years. They have 2 operating rooms that have never been opened. And then they tell me, we have a CAT scan here, but it isn't operating on all the hours, so they come to Grand Prairie to get CAT scans. And then I talked to some of your local counselors, and I'm told that Grand Prairie, hey, just go to Dawson Creek and get services. So just know, this is not how our province should be. So as I get into talking about how we need a fair deal from Ottawa, do know that I do not think we will have any credibility having that argument as long as we continue to do the same thing to our municipalities and to our northern regions in particular. So I just wanted you to be aware of that I've got a lot of good feedback, and I'm more than happy for you to tell me more. I am here to learn, and I'm here hopefully to be one of the other voices that will advocate for you too. So let me tell you why I'm running. Let me tell you why I think we are all here in this room tonight. Is that I think one of the reasons we're here is because the lockdowns of the last 2 years have traumatized us all in different ways. So the number of people who have aging loved ones who are suffering from loneliness and not being able to see family, or those of you who had a family member die, they weren't able to say a proper goodbye. I know that there's been a mischaracterization of those who have been part of the Freedom Convoy and part of the vaccine choice movement as one of the terms, fringe minority with unacceptable views. I'll tell you what I saw in Calgary and Edmonton. So just know this isn't just a rural or small city issue. In Calgary and Edmonton, there's a huge group of parents, moms and dads in the 30s and 40s who are desperately concerned about what the last 2 years have done to their kids. The mental health issues, the fear, the anxiety, the division that was caused by dividing people into vaxxed and unvaxxed categories, the fear that they have that if I get sick, I'm gonna make grandma and grandpa sick. Can you imagine putting that burden on a bunch of kids? I just can't even believe that that's happened over the last 2 years. We will not do that again. That's why I launched my campaign, saying very clearly, we will not lock down this province again. We will not sacrifice our children. Emerge and life is getting back to normal, and all of a sudden you're walloped with inflation. Now you guys already have it tough up here because things are a lot more expensive as the further north that you go, but just looking at electricity prices and natural gas home heating prices that happen in the winter, gasoline and diesel prices, I've been talking to people who are looking at an insurance cost that has doubled or tripled from what it used to be. And then, of course, affordable housing. When I'm talking to kids at events and hear them say, like 18, 19, 20-year-olds coming up saying that they're fearful as they see inflation and they see rising interest rates, that they may never be able to own a home. I mean, imagine just starting out in life thinking that. So that's a lot of pressure that everybody is facing, not to mention those of you who have teenagers. I can imagine that your grocery bills have gone up $200 or $300 a month as well. And then on top of that, we've got Ottawa every time we turn around imposing economic sanctions on our province. So I think the reason we're here tonight is to figure out who's the best person to stand up to Ottawa, who's going to be the best person to beat Rachel Notley, and who is going to restore our freedoms. Now, aside from Todd Loewen, I think the best person to do that is me. So let me tell you why. What I've observed is, you may not know because my signal didn't reach up to northern Alberta, but I was a radio talk show host for 6 years in Calgary and on Ched in Edmonton. And one of the things that I listened to and heard over the past 6 years is this growing divide between the people who make the decisions that impact our lives and those of us who are the impactees of those decisions. So there's a bit of a growing divide between the establishment and regular people. And I should mention this to you because it always gets asked a question about the World Economic Forum, and I should tell you I was never identified as a young global leader of tomorrow, whatever that means. But I also do know that I've done my part to erode trust in politicians because of the decision I made in 2014. And I think when I look back on that time, I was ready for unity a lot sooner than anybody else was. We made a rash decision without checking with the grassroots and our members. We both got punished for it. I lost my nomination, Jim Prentice lost the election, and we ended up with Rachel Notley for 4 years. Now, I don't know if we could have replayed that a different way in 2015, but what I do know now is that as I watch what's happened with the NDP, they have maintained their strength all this time. I don't see any polls really that have them less than 40%. And when that happens, if we see this movement bust apart again, what will happen is that Rachel Notley will win the next election. And I was beginning to see some of those cleavages form again, the same kind of cleavages that I saw when I was part of Wild Rose. Because when rural Alberta believes that they are not being listened to, they create their own party. And we had different parties sprouting up all over the place. So if I can be a voice of trying to keep our party together, that's the reason why I wanted to enter back into the race. Because I'm back because I want to fight for you. And we have the fight of our lives on our hands in looking at what Ottawa is trying to do to us. And let me tell you how I would approach it. For me, it's not enough to say in the question of unity, just follow me and we'll be unified. You have to address the things that have caused disunity in the first place. And the first thing, of course, is the lockdowns. We broke a promise to our Conservative and UCP base. We had said for 18 months, no vaccine mandates, no vaccine passports, no division. And then with that reversal, I think we lost a large portion of the trust of the public. So that's one reason why I launched on that policy and why we have to correct that. But the second issue was issues of autonomy. Because there are different groups that have started up. The Alberta Prosperity Project is one. Dennis Motry has been doing events all around the province, getting hundreds of people out talking about the need for greater autonomy, either inside. He's also actually, quite frankly, doing a petition to see whether or not it needs to be outside of Canada. I personally think that we can save the country, but I think we have to do that by exercising autonomy, by taking the actions that the public has been asking us to take for literally 20 years. So I launched with the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and the Eastern media don't seem to like it much. The Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Warren Kinsella, I figure if those guys don't like it, I must be on the right track. So, but it is very simple. I mean, if you go and read the Constitution, just read section 92, 92A, 93, 94, 95, and you will see that we have a lot of power that has been granted to us by our founders. Our province, our country was founded on the basis that there are certain sovereign powers granted to central government and other sovereign powers granted to the provincial governments. It is written that way. It talks about exclusive jurisdiction. And part of what we would do with the Sovereignty Act is just put Ottawa on notice. We maybe have been a little bit lazy. We may have been a little bit careless. We may have been a little bit too trusting. We allowed them to interfere in every single area of our provincial jurisdiction, and we're just now drawing a line. Get back in your own lane and stay there. So the Sovereignty Act would simply say, we will not enforce any federal policy or law that violates our constitutional rights and jurisdiction or violates the rights of our citizens under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It actually enforces the law on what I've described as a lawless Ottawa. Ottawa has been the one who declared war on us when in November of 2015, they told us they would not allow us to export our resources to the market anymore. And I want to go through that a little bit with you because there are others who are proposing a softer approach or a different approach, writing letters, going and doing diplomatic visits, arguing things out through the court. And I'll tell you why I think we need to be a lot more direct in this. The first thing I will go back to, I have 3 examples of when we tried to do our part to be reasonable. So Rachel Notley, she said we would get social license. Do you remember that? We were trying to convince the rest of the country that we should be allowed to build pipelines. And so she had that historic press conference. I don't know if you remember it. I do, because I call it the hostage taking. It's when we had all of the oil sands company executives standing behind her looking very morose as she announced that we would have a carbon tax. The reason we have a carbon tax is because Rachel Notley brought it in. She announced that we were going to phase out coal. And remember, we had just finished building the Keep Hills plant, a new supercritical plant. It was 2 years in operation before they ended up phasing it out. Do you want to know why your power bills are higher? It's because we had to pay out those companies for the stranded asset loss that government caused. Third thing was a cap on oil sands emissions. Now, this was all supposed to get us social license. And what happened? The federal government passed Bill C-48, which bans us from being able to export bitumen off the coast of British Columbia in the north. They also brought through Bill C-69, which we've been calling the No More Pipelines bill, but it really is the No More Build Anything in Alberta Ever Again Without Federal Approval bill, because it includes everything that has previously been in our provincial jurisdiction. Is why we won in the Court of Appeal when this was first argued a few weeks ago, and every other province has now joined us in the appeal because the federal government is so deep in our lane and in such violation of the Constitution that the court said this was ridiculous. Then in addition to that, they canceled the Northern Gateway pipeline project. Energy East, the plug was pulled on that because after $1 billion of regulatory spending, they had no idea how they'd get to the finish line on an approval on that project. And it wasn't the only one. We also had the Tech Frontier mine. After $1 billion spent, it was a $15 billion project, they pulled the plug because they didn't know how they would get the final approval because the process is so murky that they didn't know how to get to the end. And then on top of that, of course, Keystone XL gets canceled 5 seconds after Joe Biden becomes US president. And they didn't say a word of support for that project. They said, oh, well, guess that's how the Americans roll. That's what happened. That's what social license looks like when you try to placate. So then we got a new Quebec Premier, Francois Legault. Fresh start. And I think everybody thought he's a businessman. Maybe we can go. Maybe we could restart Energy East. Our premier went out there. They spoke en français. They talked about how we were going to have natural gas exported off the coast to help our friends in Europe. And he said he wouldn't stand in the way initially. But then he was asked about Energy East. And what did he say? He said, oh, we don't want Alberta's dirty oil. And then a couple of days later, they ended up with a little bit of extra money in the equalization fund, and they distributed it based on historical distributions, and Quebec got an additional $1 billion. So they didn't want our dirty oil, but you bet, keep the money flow coming. That was Quebec's attitude. And do you think they've stopped there? No, we now have seen Francois Legault eliminate oil and gas production in his province. He's pulled all the oil and gas leases. This is hurting Alberta-based companies. One company, Questerre Energy, has been operating in Quebec for 20 years. They now have an $18 billion claim against the Quebec government for pulling the plug on their leases. That is how significant the Quebec natural gas resources are that they want to keep in the ground. And on top of that, Forget about exporting LNG. Port Saguenay project was supposed to go ahead. It got canceled too, just before Russia invaded Ukraine. And now what are we seeing with our friends in Germany? They are now having to turn back on their coal plants because of their over-reliance on Russian natural gas. That is what happens when you think, oh, maybe we can negotiate with Quebec. No. So the third thing we decided to do is elevate it. Said, all right, we will launch a constitutional discussion by passing a referendum saying we wanted to take equalization out of the Constitution. And we got a 62% approval rating on that. We got the mandate. We were ready to go. We figured this would be the opening so that we could start talking about a new relationship with Canada. And what did Justin Trudeau give us? He gave us Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, perhaps the most anti-energy and anti-fertilizer, and it must now be said, Environment Minister we could possibly ever see. When you look at what they have now done, I mean, I'll put it into context who Stephen Guilbeault is if you didn't know. He scaled the roof of Ralph Klein's house when Ralph was premier to protest oil and gas. He scaled the CN Tower. He hates oil and gas so much. And if you look at what happened in the last 2 weeks, if you think we're making any headway whatsoever, he has now said he wants to bring through a special cap and trade program. After everything they've done, leveled on our industry, a special cap and trade program that is going to apply just to oil and natural gas. They'll only be allowed to trade the credits with each other, and they must reduce their emissions 50% by 2030, 8 years. It's impossible. You can't do that without shutting it in, and that's the point, right? And then, just because they hadn't doubled down enough, then they doubled down on fertilizer use, saying that they wanted our farmers to reduce their fertilizer use by 30%. We're in the middle of an energy crisis. We're in the middle of a global food security crisis. There are 20 million people in Africa that they fear are going to die of malnutrition because of the disruption in fertilizer and the food supply chain based on what's happening in Ukraine. And this is the answer that our federal government gives us. This is why I am saying that we have to say very clearly, enough is enough. Enough of the economic sanctions, enough of robbing us blind, and they have taken $600 billion out of this province since the 1960s. And since we know who's generating most of that revenue for our province, they've been taking that amount of money out of this region since the 1960s. And they're not done yet. Because now that everybody's recovering a little bit, you guys know how hard it's been since 2014. Now our companies are profitable again, they're drilling again, they're making some money again, they're paying their shareholders who haven't been paid for a number of years. Now, Rachel Notley's boss, Jagmeet Singh, who's our co-prime minister, he said as a condition for continuing to support Justin Trudeau until 2025, he wants a windfall profits tax on the oil and gas sector. That's coming. Guaranteed that's coming in the fall. So now they've just decided they're going to steal it. So here's what I would say to you. I believe a constitutional reckoning is coming, and it has to. And there's a reason why it has to. Because when I look at the growth in our economy, we are going to be the second largest economy in the country within the next few years. And we were supposed to get there by 2016, but because of world events and what happened, we're a little bit behind now. But within the next few years, we'll be the second largest economy. Within the next 30 years, we're going to keep on growing at the population rate that we have, and we will double in population size by 2050. We will be the second most populous province in the country. So I ask you this, how do we continue operating under constitutional rules that gives Quebec 24 Senate seats and gives us 6 when we're the second biggest player in Confederation? And how would we continue operating under rules that give Quebec a guaranteed number of House of Commons seats, which is greater than the number that we get when we are the second most populous province? And why would we continue to operate under constitutional rules that give Quebec 3 guaranteed appointments to the Supreme Court out of 9 when we get none? Especially since the Supreme Court has been making so many life or death decisions over how we develop our resources and what this constitutional balance would be. We are clearly going to have to renegotiate the terms under which we deal with the rest of Canada. We have to stop being a junior player. We have to start acting like a senior partner. And the reason I feel so strongly about this was one of the last segments I did when I was on radio was with a scholar by the name of Germain Belzile from the Montreal Economic Institute. And I asked him a simple question. I said, why does Quebec hate us so much? And he said, Quebec doesn't hate you. They just don't think about you at all. They are too busy thinking about themselves. And it's time for you to think about yourself for a change. And so that's what the Sovereignty Act is all about. It's about making sure that we reset, yes. Making sure we reset the relationship with the rest of the country, and we get the same rights that Quebec has. We get treated like a nation within a nation, just like Quebec is, and like Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has said he wants to be treated as well. So when you think about the use of the Sovereignty Act, I can tell you, I think the first use may come in the fall. If you saw the stories on July the 4th, Jean-Yves Duclos, who is the federal health minister, he said there's now no such thing as being fully vaxxed, that we are going to be required to have a booster shot every 9 months. That's his term, required. So what does that mean? I mean, did you think that those vaccine mandates were over? No, no, no. They were just suspended, and we're already starting to see them come back in. In addition, there's a real push on to make it mandatory for kids under the age of 12 to get that vaccination. I can tell you, the parents I talked to, exactly, they are not interested at all. So this would be the use of the Sovereignty Act. They bring through mandates. We say health is a provincial area of jurisdiction. The right to bodily choice is guaranteed under a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as is Section 6 mobility rights. We will not enforce that. That is what we need to do. And Quebec already did this in a measure. When they came through with the Emergencies Act, which we all know now, having watched the testimony, there was no justification for that whatsoever. So what happened is Quebec convened what they call their National Assembly, and they passed a motion saying we will not enforce that. Why didn't we do that? Why didn't we say, no, we're not going to take political prisoners like Tamara Leach. We're not going to enforce that. Why didn't we say, no, actually move your money over to a credit union as they started seizing and freezing bank accounts? We're not going to enforce that. Those are the things that we have the power to do, and those are the things that we should have done. And those are the things we might have to do if they continue to push this in the fall. The other thing I would say about getting into a sovereign frame of mind is that I've been talking about economic corridors since 2009, when I was in politics the last time. But I discovered we've been talking about economic corridors in this province since the 1930s. It was Ernest Manning who first raised them. I think we better realize after 100 years, Ottawa is not going to build these for us. If we want them built, we have to build them ourselves. And the Beery First Plan, yes. So I'm sure you've got an idea for a few of the corridors yourself, but I'll tell you the one that's the furthest along. It's the one that would take it would go from Fort McMurray through Saskatchewan and Manitoba to Hudson Bay, either the Port of Churchill or the Port of Port Nelson. Nelson apparently is open 9 months out of the year, so it might be a better port. But think about what we could do. If we partner with our First Nations, and there's 14 First Nations that want to partner with us on this. There's 100 First Nations that have oil and gas development, by the way. But if we partner with First Nations, then we would be able to build a railway line. We'd be able to build a new highway. We would be able to build transmission lines so that Manitoba could send its electricity back this way. And then, of course, we would build oil and gas pipelines. But we could also build broadband internet access. We could bring clean drinking water. We could make sure that there's home heating. We could bring biodiesel. And we could make sure that those northern communities have everything that they need to be prosperous and successful and be able to attract new development. And why stop there? Why not find another First Nations partnership so that we can build a corridor to Thunder Bay, then we have access to the Great Lakes system, and then build another one to Tuktoyaktuk, and we'd be able to open up all of the north and their mining and mineral wealth. Then we'd also be able to go over to the Port of Prince Rupert and be able to have all of that for our forestry and agriculture as well. When I mentioned this at the National Coalition of Chiefs about a month ago, I met Fort McKay Chief Mel Granjam. He said, oh yeah, we've just approved a 400,000 barrel per day oil sands operation. We need new access to markets. I know those guys. I'd be willing to work with you on that. We can take the lead on economic reconciliation with our First Nations. And I'm going to tell you this. If Ottawa says, no, you can't do that, that's our territory, then let them take us to court. Because I could argue all day long about why we should be partnering with First Nations to bring clean drinking water and economic prosperity and jobs, and make sure that we have a meaningful reconciliation with our First Nations, because we'll be in partnership with them. They have Section 35 charter rights too. They have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People too, which gives them the right to say yes to resource development as well. That's why I think we can take the lead, and that's why I think we can win. I think we can argue this out and flip the tables on the feds. The feds invade our turf all the time, and then they make us go to court and take years and years and years to resolve it. Let's take the lead and then let them take us to court for a change. Now here's the other, thank you. Now, of course, none of this is going to have any credibility until we get our own house in order, which brings me to healthcare. I have to tell you, I simply don't trust a single word Alberta Health Services tells me anymore, honestly. Especially after visiting here and seeing how much unused capacity there is in all of our facilities that we have built, and they're telling us that there isn't a single thing that they can do about it. They keep telling us we're not able to attract doctors to Northern Alberta. Well, I heard a story in High Prairie about a doctor who was desperately trying to attract doctors, had some success. All he needed to do was allow them admittance privileges at the hospital. That's the model that works. The doctors have a private practice and then they can do some work at the hospital. That becomes an attractor. And the health region said no. So they are standing in the way of our communities being able to recruit the health professionals they need, and we are not getting the services that we need in all of our communities. And so one of the things that I would do, knowing this, is that I would make sure that we dispatch a team from the Alberta Health Quality Council. Remember, they report directly to the minister. They are not under the umbrella of Alberta Health Services. Dispatch them to every single rural hospital. We have 106 facilities in the province. And tell me, how many operating rooms do we have that are not in service? How many wings of hospitals have been closed or shut down? How many floors have been mothballed? How many beds, for acute care, are occupied by people who are just awaiting placement in long-term care? I'm hearing in rural communities it's as high as 60%. So now you wonder why you can't get in when you go into an operating room. You're saying, well, aren't we moving the patients along? Well, no, if you've got somebody sitting there for 6 months or a year or 2 years, of course you're not going to open up those beds. There are more comfortable ways for us to be able to provide transition housing as our seniors are waiting for long-term placement. So those are the things that we have to look at doing. The other thing that I have proposed is a health spending account, and there's a reason for that. Because if we have, part of the problem that we have in healthcare is that it is, as has been often said, it is a sickness system as opposed to a wellness system. It only steps in when you are in a position where you're in dire need because you've already become sick. And when you talk to doctors, even in Calgary and Edmonton, they say a lot of the patients in hospital are people who have chronic diseases that have not been managed well, so they become acute, whether it's diabetes or hypertension or COPD or obesity. So if we pay a little bit of money at the front end, deposit $300 into a health spending account, allow for employers to contribute to that, allow for you to contribute to it tax-free, now we have a base of funding so that people can start paying for all the things that aren't covered by healthcare. This is another thing I learned from the vaccine choicers. Many of them are just clean living folks. They believe in their immune system. They believe by healthy eating and exercise proper vitamin D levels going into the fall season. They believe by doing all of these things, they'll be able to keep themselves well. And so they all use these alternative practitioners, the chiropractors and the physiotherapists and naturopaths and nutritionists, counselors, like there's a whole range of health practitioners that we don't cover. And I'm particularly concerned about mental health. And so we need to make sure that we've got therapists and counselors that are covered so that we can have, especially for our kids, 3 or 4 sessions to be able to get them back on track so that we know that they'll be able to thrive as they go through the season. So that's the reason why I proposed it, because I think that we need to put more dollars into your hands so that we can fundamentally transform the system. And then finally, once we do that facility review and it reveals what I suspect it's going to reveal, we will be able to tell the public we need to go back to individual hospital boards. We need to have local community members making the decisions about the services that you need in your community. And of course we do, because your community is going to change. You're a very young population. You need to have the capacity to deliver babies and provide the childcare that is needed. As you age, you're going to need to have somebody who's flexible to make the decisions to add more knee and hip replacements and so on and so forth. That can only be done at the local level. And I tell you, I look at Grand Prairie as being a regional hub. There's about 7 or 8 other hospitals in here. And if we were operating properly, you should be able to get the vast majority of your services here. And maybe we have additional surgeries that are done at some of the auxiliary hospitals in Beaver Lodge and elsewhere. That's how the system should work. And that's the kind of system that we need to move to, but we've got to get started. We've got to get started fast. So let me just say a word about party unity, because aside from Todd, you probably noticed I got a little bit kicked around in the debate a couple of days ago. If you watched it, did anyone watch it? Okay, so you did see that. It's got a little picked on. So you might think that there is a lot of disunity in the party. I just look at that as a bit of a rough and tumble of politics. I have great respect for everyone who's on that stage. I think many of them have wonderful attributes that will make them great cabinet ministers. And so, but I also should mention that we have to do some work in rebuilding the confidence that people have in our officials, because one of the big problems that we have is that we've eroded the role of the individual MLA. Todd is one of the very few who stood up and understands the role, and understands it not only because of his wild history, but you know what? It is also the progressive conservative history too. The idea that the individual MLA is your voice, your representative. We should not be having staffers in the Premier's office criticizing and demeaning our elected representatives, because that is criticizing and demeaning your choice, and that is not appropriate. That's got to stop. We also have to make sure that our MLAs have a process to bring their ideas forward. Todd can talk more about that. He was in there. But there used to be a process where MLAs were able to come to caucus and they were able to have full-throated debates about the things that were of importance to them in their riding. And sometimes it's just a matter of being heard. Everybody's got to make compromise. But if you don't even have a chance to make the argument, of course you're going to end up with this disunity and division. In addition, one of the things that Klein said is he told his cabinet ministers, if you can't get your caucus behind you, you can't pass that policy, because if we can't get our own people to agree, you'll never convince Albertans to agree. That practice has to be brought back as well. As last one, is that we have to make sure that there are free votes in the legislature. I do know how important it is for a person to be able to vote their conscience. One of the reasons why I quit radio is that I was told I had to bring my coverage on COVID in alignment with the narrative. And after watching Dr. Pierre Corey give testimony in the Senate about his protocol for treatment, and Dr. Peter McCullough giving his testimony in the Texas Senate, when they said that we could have saved 85% of those lives, I said, there's no way I'm following this narrative. So I left and I ended up going on to Western Standard, and I did 7 segments of all the people I wasn't allowed to interview when I was on mainstream media. But to me, I know I'm allergic to saying things or doing things that are against my conscience. I know that all the good people who put their name forward for public office are just as allergic, which is part of the reason why we try for consensus. We try to keep things unified. But if there are certain issues where a person has to vote what they think is in your best interest or in the interest of their heart, we've got to allow that for that to happen.
Yeah.
So there you have it. That's how I think we bring unity. That's how I think we bring the party back together, is that we become the party of liberty. We become the party that is going to advance Alberta's interests. And I think that if we are principled, which we are, our wild rules are our UCP policies, you know what? I read the policy and principles book and said, my gosh, this comes from the Wild Rose. So the Wild Rose has had a huge influence on the UCP, but the principles and policies are sound. We're going to work hard, we're going to succeed, and we will be able to make Alberta the freest place in the country. And I know Pierre Poilievre has aspirations to become Prime Minister. If he succeeds, he wants to make it the freest place in the world. So we're going to make it the freest. So please join me. If you haven't got a membership here, you can do that on site. You can also go online to daniellesmith.ca, and I hope you'll join me so together we can work to put Alberta first. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you.